Welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute at the University of Hong Kong and also a co-convener of the Chinese Business History cluster at the Institute. And I'm also joined today by my colleague, Professor John Wong, who is the other co-convener of the cluster. So today we're very glad and honored to welcome to the webinar series Dr. Ren Jian. Um, Dr. Ren is a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and Hoover History Lab with a PhD in history from Rutgers University. Dr. Ren is a historian of diplomacy, business, and migration in China-Latin America relations, and is working currently on a book manuscript titled Dancing on the Periphery, China, Latin America, and the Cold War. And today he's going to talk to us in his talk about his current research, and his talk is entitled Pioneers in a Distant Land, the Overseas Chinese Business Community in South America, 1960 to 2000. Before I hand things over to Dr. Ren, as usual, we will have around 30 minutes of presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out during the Q&A period, and Dr. Ren can respond to it. But Jen, I don't want to take up any more of your time, so please feel free to get started.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, Professor Moazin and Professor Wong. Well, I'm really happy to join the Hong Kong U Chinese Business History webinar because in the US, my areas of study and my work have been heavily framed by a US national security perspective. But I'm writing a book on the history of diplomacy, business, and migration between China and Latin America in the Cold War era. And being able to hear comments and questions from scholars and students in Asia in business history, not really contaminated by national security discussion, will be so precious to me. So in the last 2 years, the study of China-Latin America connections suddenly became a hot topic in the US. And in some ways in China, when President Xi truly supported the emergence of area studies in China to expand China's global footprint. In the US, the Trump administration published the National Security Strategy in 2025 that prioritized addressing the Chinese influence in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere. And in January 2026, we had the capture of Maduro, who has been very connected to Chinese interests in the region. So a lot of commentators in the US are using the winners and losers language to discuss US-China competition in Latin America. Well, but in fact, Chinese influences are way more extensive than state behaviors. So now you have companies like BYD, Pinduoduo, Didi doing very well in the region, but you also have short drama makers in TikTok. You have crypto bros, loan sharks, and drug cartels from China in Latin America. It is vibrant and one of the best regions for all kinds of industries. Well, in my work, I argue that we cannot measure great power competitions by winners and losers, but to recognize that Chinese businesses are here to stay in the region, and there needs to be calm and calculated US policies to different sectors rather than pure confrontation against China in all ways. And for this purpose, we need to study more history because it's crucial to understand the cultural roots of Chinese roles and influence in Latin America and how state individual dynamics evolved. I mean, the relationship between Chinese individuals and the Chinese state in the region, but also Chinese individuals and the Latin American governments in the region. So I also include the importance of business history of Latin Americans in China here in the PowerPoint. As you probably know, in Hong Kong and many cities in mainland China, you have foods from across Latin America, like avocado from Mexico, cherries from Chile, blueberries from Peru, and shrimps from Argentina. So the Latin American businesses actually have a great footprint all across China, and trade is a leverage for China now in Latin America to encounter uh, the great power competition with the US because it creates room for the Chinese state to negotiate with the Latin American governments because the Latin American governments will also face pressures from, for example, the agriculture sectors. Well, that's not necessarily the Chinese business history, so I'm not going to include that in the talk. Many people have asked me, so which historical period and which group of people are most interested in Latin America and China relations? I would say it's the first generation migrants who arrived in Latin America during the Mao era. So why? First of all, it's very understudied. There are many books on the indentured laborers in the 19th century and the early 20th century after they became free and became small business owners and workers. And there are many sociological and anthropological studies on the newer immigrants after the 1990s. There are many emerging scholars in China right now doing this kind of research for the new wave of immigration. The Mao era was long considered as a closed period with very limited migration to such a distant region, which is actually wrong from my archival research and interview with people. So the main source of Chinese migration to Latin America of all time, the people from Jiangmen, Gongmun, in Guangdong province found their ways to Hong Kong in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and then migrated to Latin America in all kinds of ways, legal or illegal, illegal. There are three counties under the management of Jiangmen City. First of all, Xinhui. Uh, Most of the Xinhui people went to Cuba, and Hesan people went to Chile, and Enping people went to Venezuela. We don't have the exact data for them, for their population and the flow of people, because most of them, like I just mentioned, used forged paperwork. But there's actually a museum of overseas Chinese in Jiangmen right now, which was open, I think, during the pandemic, and it's now welcoming visitors. And they have a rough calculation of, oh, well, it should be the historical height of Germany's migration to countries around the world. But I mean, it's a rough calculation. And the Mao era was also a time of great political change for not only for Chinese in China, but for Chinese in Latin America, because there were all kinds of Chinese exclusion policies or labor laws across Latin American countries in what we think in China, the Republic period. Because of China's role in World War II and Kuomintang's efforts, actually during the Chinese Civil War to convince the Latin American states. Latin American countries canceled most Chinese exclusion measures, and the new wave, the new group of Chinese migration from China to Latin America from the 1940s to 60s worked hard, expanded their businesses, and built a much wealthier image of the Chinese locally with the spirit of entrepreneurship. And very importantly, the Chinese immigrants during the early Cold War period, throughout the Mao period, helped agents from the PRC, the People's Republic of China, to establish local networks and provided logistic support for state actors, well, from mainland China, because most Latin American countries maintained diplomatic relations with Taiwan until the 1970s and many until the 21st century. For example, now we have the China-US-Panama dispute, but actually China established diplomatic relations with Panama very late in 2015 to 17, I think. So the immigrants' actions were actually the foundations of contemporary political relations because back then the mainland Chinese agents didn't really have the resources, the connections, and many of them didn't speak Spanish before being dispatched to Latin American countries. So many Chinese immigrants actually became interpreters for Chinese states agents, and these Chinese immigrants were kind of wealthier business owners in many Latin American countries. And it's well documented in archival materials in Taiwan, in Chile, in Mexico, and not sure about Venezuela because I didn't do research there, and I could not have the chance because of the political turbulence. So we have a conflicting story of wealthier Chinese supporting the communist regime during the Cold War, which is kind of weird. But I will provide my answer to this situation in a second. Well, the common model of success for the first generation Chinese migrants to Latin America during the Mao period is to start from small retailers, then import and export between the Americas and Asia, mostly Taiwan and Hong Kong, and then went into manufacturing, such as producing plastic bags, which was related to shops and supermarkets they owned, and finally started real estate and financing chains for their compatriots. The Cantonese people relied on trusted family networks and started from very basic and small shops, the basic roles, and then when they became bigger, they imported machinery from Taiwan, thanks for progress in Taiwan's industrialization and smooth channel of communication between the Kuomintang regime in Taiwan and the Chinese nationalist embassies across Latin America. Well, one of the most promising case study was Alberto Fong Xunmao in Venezuela, who went through this model and became widely known as the most wealthy person from Enping, the county below the management of Jiangmen, for the main source of immigration to Venezuela. Well, we often talk about the importance of family networks in diasporic businesses, but it's more solid when it comes to comparison. So Harry Song Feiqing, was one of the most famous industrialists in Republican China before 1949. And he was the founder of the East Asian Jute Factory for clothing in Tianjin, who later became more infamous for his conversation with Liu Shaoqi about the future of patriotic private industrialists after the founding of the People's Republic of China. And he was regarded like a red capitalist industrialist in the early PRC. But he chose to move to Argentina through Hong Kong in 1950. Well, he mentioned in his diary that Hong Kong would not be safe for people like him in the long term, and he needed to go as far as possible from China, then to Argentina, the physically most distant country from China. He brought money to establish factories in Argentina and Brazil, but eventually failed. In his diaries, he blamed the lack of trusted connections like the Cantonese people in Latin America. And he was actually scammed by the Chinese in the region and by one of the most trusted partner of him, who actually took his investment fund and then reported to the Kuomintang embassy in Brazil to report him as a communist agent because Song used a quote from Mao Zedong in his letter to this friend. So back to my question about the incentives for the Chinese migrants, the Chinese emergent business owners to cooperate with the PRC during the Cold War era. I think Cold War ideological fear was real, and it's the most important part for my answer of why the increasingly wealthy Chinese business people in Latin America supported the Chinese Communist Party in terms of like everyday conversation and logistic support. I've I I've seen multiple archival documents that people were pressured and pushed by the anti-communist faction inside the Chinese community in Latin America whenever they had the slightest tendency of being in touch with mainland China. And back then in Cold War Latin America, it was also a time when in many countries, the local leftist movement was widespread and influential. And many of the Chinese business owners will also want to have local political capital for being leftist. They would know the possible presidential candidates in their countries, for example. And also, many business owners are very opportunistic, and they saw the future of a possible PRC and their resident states diplomatic relations, and they saw the future of the PRC kicking Taiwan out from the country of their residence. And a good example of this is the owner of a famous Chinese restaurant in Santiago de Chile, who used his restaurant as the venue for PRC agents to meet with Chilean politicians. And later he became the director of Chinese Migrant Association in Chile after Chile recognized recognized the People's Republic of China. And here is the photo of uh, the venue he provided for Chinese diplomats and Chilean leftist politicians in his restaurants. And you can see that it's not a typical Chinese restaurant in the region. It fits the image of being increasingly rich and luxurious. They have all kinds of Chinese food that mimics uh, the U.S. dishes, the higher end Chinese restaurants in the US. And the restaurants were set up very close to the center of political power in Santiago de Chile and the historical center, the Plaza de Armas de Santiago in Santiago de Chile. And you can tell that it was set up intentionally. And the restaurant experienced change of ownership after the Cold War. Well, I mean, after the Chinese government had a solid position in their relationship with Allende and then the Pinochet regime during the 1980s and 90s, and it's continued to exist in current Santiago de Chile, and it's actually branded as the best American Chinese food in the country in 2026. That's the current menu. All right, I think my time is going to end very soon. So let me end briefly with sources. To study the Chinese business and diasporic history with Latin American countries, first of all, we have pretty rich sources in all kinds of Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives. I have to say, excluding mainland China, because the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives are limiting access for well, most of the researchers. But you can find the sources in Latin American countries, especially Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Argentina, and you can also find sources in Taipei, in Academia Sinica, which has a rich connection of observing leftist Chinese entrepreneurs in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Paraguay, Uruguay. And also in the US, there are considerable private collections about Chinese Chinese entrepreneurs in Latin America. The Song Fei-qing diaries and documents are all in the Hoover institutions are the Hoover Institution archives. And at Berkeley, there are newspaper clippings about Chinese businesses in Latin America throughout the Cold War period. And at Yale, there was a collection of Chinese nationalist diplomats in Chile and Ecuador, Tang Wu, who was responsible for maintaining relations with Chinese migrants associations and businesses across the region. And I have to say that, well, I'm writing a book containing 5 to 6 countries, but I cannot cover Latin America as an entire region. And I spend most of my time in Cuba and Chile, and I don't have the analytical depth into countries such as Venezuela, such as Brazil. So I would like to say, I hope my research and the sharing of my talk could inspire more people to be interested in studying China-Latin America relations and the past and present and future of Chinese businesses, not including trade, but also services, but also innovations to Latin America. And there are so many questions remain unanswered. For example, most of the migrants came from came from Xiamen, but via Hong Kong to Latin America. So are there documents and possible research opportunities in Hong Kong for this connection? And the Chinese business owners, especially the wealthier ones, travel very frequently between Latin American countries and also to the US and Canada. And this topic is very understudied in Chinese diasporic studies in the Americas, it, uh, at least in the US, in English. And I wish to see more on this kind of analysis. All right, so thank you very much. Oh, by the way, the I need to mention this. So this is a documentary about the Enping people in Venezuela, which was produced by the county television from Enping in 2000, which was a huge production for a county level for county level television in China and was award winning. And most of the interviews in the documentaries are precious historical materials for researchers. I encourage those who can understand Cantonese to watch this documentary. It's unfortunately it doesn't have subtitles. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Jian, for your presentation. As I said, we now have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I can read them out, and Dr. Ren can get back to you. Um, okay, we have one question from Lin Yinghua. So the question is, thank you, Dr. Ren, for this wonderful talk. I'm originally from Sunhui, Xinhui, but I betrayed, quote unquote, my hometown, and I'm based in Chile now. I work in the cultural heritage field as well. I'm thus very interested that if we can still visit some of the overseas Chinese sites in Santiago now. Uh, and could you please explain a little bit what the restaurant was in Chile that you mentioned in one of your slides? Last but not least, may I know the name of the restaurant you mentioned as the best Chinese food in Chile? Thank you.
Wait me a second. No problem, and thank you very much for the question. I'm I'm sharing my screen again to provide the audience with this information. So it's called Palacio Danubio Azul, and in the English version, it labels itself as best Chinese American restaurant in town. But it actually changed address after the Cold War. So during the Mao period, it was the same name, but in a different address closer to Palacio de Moneda.
Um, I'm not sure whether do you want to also answer the or comment on the first part of the question?
Oh, let me see.
Whether we can still visit some of the overseas Chinese sites in Santiago now, and also what the restaurant was in Chile.
Well, I mean, Santiago, Chile doesn't have a Chinatown right now because, well, it has a informal Chinatown after the newest wave of migration from Zhejiang, from Fujian, after the 2000 to start their business around the central train station in Santiago de Chile. And that's how I met with most of the people in San Diego. So, well, I don't think there are like historical heritage sites for uh, the Chinese in Chile for like public exhibition, and most of the historical sites were kind of either demolished or influenced by the dictatorship after, well, after Allende.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Audrey Xiang, and it says, I'm from Macau, and my research focuses on migration and knowledge circulation across port regions with Macau as my core study site. I would like to ask, in your existing research materials, have you observed statistical
Mhm.
data sets regarding Macau? Also, how do you contextualize Macau in your work, especially when comparing it with Hong Kong as a comparable case? Thank you.
That's a great question. Actually, Macau was featured in the literature of Chinese indentured laborers in the 19th century to Latin America a lot for providing data of transporting the what do we call it? The pigs from China to the Americas, and but I want to say that there's certainly room for research in the Cold War era for uh, Macau in terms of everyday life of Chinese migrants from Latin America back to China, because there were several revolutions and political revolts in Latin America, such as the Cuban Revolution, and then the Chilean experiment of socialism. And many Chinese immigrants back then were not able to obtain paperwork for Hong Kong because it's much harder to get an ID for Hong Kong. So they took the ship to Macau first and stayed there temporarily, waiting for the documents, maybe for 3 years, 5 years, to eventually go to Hong Kong, or waiting for the political situation to be stable in their country of residence in the Americas, and then travel back. So Macau was a temporary shelter for a lot of Latin American or Chinese Latin Americans, but also their spouse. So there were women, mostly women of Latin American origin, who stay with their husbands in Macau, but many of them were transported back to Latin American countries by their own governments. Uh, the most uh, obvious case was Mexico, which had a state-sponsored collective effort to transport these women back to Mexico in the 1960s.
All right, thank you. Um, the next question comes from Zhang Yue. And the question is, thank you so much, Dr. Ren, for this fascinating and informative talk. My question is about the recent Chinese investment in infrastructure in Latin America, such as the construction of Chancay Port in Peru, Bogota Metro, and BYD factory zones in Brazil. Do these projects bring new Chinese immigrants to Latin American countries? How do these projects influence the relations between the Chinese communities and governments of these countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a question that I really want to answer, because that's also a purpose of my talk and similar talks for me at Hoover, at different institutions in the US, because the Chinese companies have a bigger role in Latin America, but mostly they hire people from China to the region. But there are so many Latin Americans of Chinese descent who are fluent in English, Spanish, or Portuguese and Chinese languages, either Cantonese or Hokkien or Mandarin, who could work for the companies and who have cultural roots in the country, who have connections, who knows how to work for a transnational company. And I think the Chinese companies certainly need to be open mind open-minded in terms of hiring people, and the labor cost in most Latin American countries for the younger overseas Chinese in the region are not that high, and it's certainly doable. And I also want to mention the parallel of diasporic studies and current political economic studies about Chinese corporations in the region. Because, for example, BYD is facing the same problem that early Chinese migrants faced in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that the local governments in Latin America have strict labor laws, and they have complicated union issues for all foreign countries. And BYD is currently experiencing the investigation of the Department of Labor of the Brazilian government. And there are so many historical precedents for current Chinese, corporations and all kind of initiatives in Latin America that can draw from. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question comes from Sondri Shaw. Do you find that the new Chinese migrants form connections with the descendants of first generation migrants who have become creolized, or do they stay isolated in new communities?
Another great question. It depends on how we define new. So if we define new as, well, the main source of Chinese migration to Latin America today is those who came after China's reform and opening up. Well, most of the Cantonese people did maintain close connections with second generation Chinese who are also from the Gangmun region, and that's how it works for century-long kingship networks, and they learn Spanish pretty fast. But I mean, for there are also communities coming from northern China right now to Latin America to do all kinds of businesses. So they probably have fewer ties with the previous generations of the Cantonese and Hokkien people living in Latin America.
All right, thanks. The next question comes from Professor Sufumi So, and she asks, or she says, interesting topic. In Hong Kong, I wonder if there are materials for your research at the Donghua Hospital Archive and the University Service Center at CUHK. Have you looked at their collections before? Another question is the link through Macau, Portugal, and Brazil for migration and business during the Mao era. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, this is a question I really want to answer, but I could not because I didn't do research in Hong Kong. I hoped I did my research in Hong Kong. But for the Macau question, uh, I think I have answered for the link to
Mhm.
Mexico, but I have not seen any materials about Brazil and Macau. Even, well, I asked my friends in Brazil to look for this kind of materials, and he didn't find any. I think it's strange, and that's why we need, if this is a topic to stay, then we need more people to explore what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Professor Shi Yuanxie, and she asks, thank you for sharing your exciting research, Doctor. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on your findings from the Latin American archives. Were most of the Chinese immigrants you encountered from Jiangmen, Xinhui, and Anping? It seems there were migrants from other out-migration regions in China based on your response regarding Macau. Did different immigrant communities form similar or different local networks in Latin America? Additionally, do the kinds of archival documents you consulted tend to represent certain social groups or limit access to particular perspectives?
Well, thank you for the question, Dr. Shi. Well, I think there's a time, most of the diverse group of Chinese migrating to Latin America came after the 1980s. So I don't think they are in the archives right now. And for many of the Latin American, especially diplomatic archives, I could only see documents until 1980s and mostly until 1975. So I was encountering a singular group of people who mainly come from Guangdong in my book, in my research. But I mean, it's a totally different situation when you do oral history in these countries because, well, there are way more diverse people, and many of the immigrants who come from northern China took bigger roles in the Chinese migrant associations now after 2000, and there's no segregation of the Chinese origins right now. And in Chile, I think one of the writer responsible for writing the local history of 120 years of Chinese migration in Chile actually comes from Dongbei. So he didn't really know things what happened in Jiangmen in Xinhui. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Um, yeah, there's another question from Jangya. Yeah, of course. If I may ask another question, if there's time, are there any differences in terms of the attitudes of the different Latin American countries and societies to Chinese immigrants? For example, are Chinese more welcomed and easier to integrate into local societies in some countries than in others? If there are indeed the differences, why so?
Yes. This is a crucial question, especially to understand what happens now. For for example, in Mexico, they have much stricter control right now for Chinese migrants than in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, because manufacturing is the main, it's the pillar industry for the Mexican economy to export to the US. And they don't want to be the hub of transferring products from China to the US, but produced locally. So many of the state governments in Mexico had a hostile attitude toward hosting Chinese investments and migrants in the country. And I think it's totally understandable, especially given their geopolitical position being a neighbor of the US. So, yeah, and this is the difference between Central and North America and South America. And if you have the opportunity to travel, you feel the differences if you hold a Chinese passport. In South American countries, things are usually more lenient, and well, that's the current issues. But historically, I think Chile was the only country who never published strict anti-Chinese or Chinese exclusion laws. And o- other Latin American countries all have more or less some kinds of anti-Chinese laws while following the US actually in the 19th centuries. So it was history, it was a historical legacy influenced by the US and fair mongering across the region. And xenophobia is also an important topic in Latin American local politics and is well documented by many monographs published in the past 20 years. And the description and the fare for the Chinese were presented in the works of many Latin American intellectuals, such as Maria de Gui in Peru. In his most famous work, he described the Chinese as sort of a vice enablers migrants in his country. And in Mexico, there was a similar description of the Chinese culture and Chinese migrant communities in the 1920s from Vasconcelos, one of the most famous Mexican educator and intellectuals after the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s. So yes, xenophobia was prevalent across Latin American countries in the first half of the 20th century, and it has significant historical legacies in particular countries, and depending on where where the thoughts and intellectuals come from. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a quick follow-up. Are the leftist or the rightist parties' governments more friendly to Chinese immigrants in Latin America?
Well, I don't see any differences in from my studies, but I'm not an expert in current relations, and I'm not an expert in migration legal affairs. So I'm not really sure about this.
All right, thanks. Uh, okay. Um, yeah, Professor Su Yuanxie just said that in my research on Chinese export lace, Latin American countries were important trade nodes during the Cold War, especially Brazil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, if I can jump in for a second, guys. I thanks very much, Jian, for giving us this great report on an fascinating and an underexplored area in Chinese business history. My question actually dovetails with what has been asked, I think, before, but in maybe in a slightly different direction. I'm interested in the migration paths, the pathways. Um, the sending end and also the in between points. Um,
Mm.
when you look at the migration paths to Latin America, how important were particular nodes in North America as they moved to Latin America in the historical context? So the in between places, to me, that's quite fascinating. And I'm also quite fascinated by the fact that what you're talking about is basically the Seyab area in Guangdong, when the Spanish speaking or the Chinese population with more Spanish inclinations were from Fujian because of the galleon trade through Manila. I mean, by the time your wave of migrations started, has it basically dissipated? So what you see is primarily the Guangdong clique and not quite the Fujian Bang in a way. So that's more the historical context. And if you were to go to more of the contemporary situation, what you are talking about seems to be moving away from southern China. You're talking about more of a pan China diaspora, which is quite true for the rest of the Chinatowns and the China enclaves around the world. Do you consider them actually a continuum? Or are we talking about two different waves and different groups of people who then, upon arrival, do not quite do not quite combine or to get together as a complete group? I mean, to me, Chinatown was somewhat of a misnomer. It's always been more of a Canto town, but now Chinatown is truly Chinatown. So, are we talking about two different groups of people? Or are we talking about the same of people who identify as one?
Thank you very much for the question. I think in many Latin American Chinatowns, the actually town was promoted by Latin American governments to be a tourist site. They were not the real Chinatown, and Chinese migrants just live by their own and across the city in many bigger cities. And and I actually think there are fewer conflicts between Chinese communities ac across time that they're more harmonious than what I could witness from historical materials. And I think that's because, well, first of all, Taiwan is not really trying to lure the Chinese immigrants to their side right now, and and many the older Chinese Cantonese migrants in Latin America are wealthy enough to support their children to travel back to China to see what China looked like. For example, after the Venezuela's economic crisis, many children of older Chinese, older Cantonese migrants travel back to live in China now. In Xiamen, there are schools targeting Venezuela returnee students, which had like 7,000 to 8,000 students in around 2015. So as you probably know, in China now, like they address erasing the boundaries between different groups of people, and it's a national identity building process. And I think being able to travel and live in China actually affected the younger generation of, well, people of Chinese descent from Latin America.
So do the young Chinese migrate, the young Chinese residents in Latin America, do they learn 普通话 or do they learn Cantonese or do they learn 台山话?
There are many Chinese language schools in Latin American cities, even in Venezuela. And
Right,
and
but
I
then in the past, like in North
yeah,
America, people
I
learn
well yeah.
different languages depending on the political persuasion or their insistence on their
Yeah.
hometown heritage. So has it been flattened into 普通话 in Latin America at this time?
So many of them learned Mandarin after
Okay.
the Chinese economic miracle. But well, personally, it's not strict academic finding, but personal feeling is that Chinese people living in Latin America are more willing to study Chinese language, well, formally study the writing, reading than Chinese Americans in the US.
But in 普通话, not
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
in their own hometown dialects.
that's right.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Maybe I can come in with a question as well. I was wondering, I mean, I always remember your article in Business History that talks about canned meat and how that was exported to Latin America from China. So I wonder whether you can talk a bit more about the commodities that we see over the second half of the 20th century that are actually being traded between China and Latin America. Because you talked a lot about businesses and ranging from
Mhm.
small to bigger businesses, but I wonder what they actually traded in.
Yeah, I mean, food, rice was the main commodity in the early period of encounter between the PRC and Latin America. And after the Cultural Revolution, they mostly exported the lighter industrial goods and also petrol, I mean oil products from Chinese refineries to Latin America, actually. So, which is, well, a possible topic of research. And yeah, I mean, the Chinese export to Latin America were mostly raw materials and small industrial goods during the second half of 20th century. And the same situation of Latin America exports to China. But they were always exploring new opportunities when China became rich. And the Latin American governments and the business groups actually predicted that in the same pace as US, well, the US counterparts in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And they started to establish the network, for example, selling salmon to 1980s China very early on. And so they are quite forward-looking.
I see. Yeah. And if you say light industrial goods, is that textiles or is it
Well, yeah, textile and also like medicine, like a cheaper antibiotics, for
oh, medicine?
example,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, or chemical materials.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I think if not, I mean we're almost out of time anyways. So if not, then what remains for me to do, Jen, is to thank you very much for giving us this talk and for very patiently answering all of our questions. I think we're all looking forward to learning more about your research in the future. And yeah, thank you also yeah, thanks to all of you for tuning in. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.